Section N, Big Woes for the Little Magician. The Little Magician is a nickname that Martin Van Buren has. So we're talking about Martin Van Buren in this section. So Martin Van Buren was the first president to actually be born in the country of America. That's cool. He's from New York, and his resume is very impressive. So he's very impressive on paper. He has a lot of experience with legislative stuff, with administrative stuff. He's also very intelligent. He's very educated. So on paper, he looks really good. However, kind of history sees him as a mediocre, kind of like a president, and there's a couple reasons why. First thing, during his presidency, there was kind of some issues going on with Canada, so there was a lot of fighting between the United States, kind of on the United States-Canada border, and Martin Van Buren not wanting to get into a war or in a conflict with Britain, more or less ignores it or remains neutral in this conflict, and that, he's not winning any friends by doing that, because a lot of people think, as president, he ought to be doing something about this conflict at the border. Another thing that happens is, we'll see later on, that there is a growing voice that's coming from the North, coming from the anti-slavery folks, especially over an issue we'll focus on later about annexing Texas or allowing Texas to become a part of the United States. So that's kind of another issue that we'll see kind of appear. And also remember, Martin Van Buren is kind of left to deal with the mess Jackson left behind, economically speaking, by killing the Bank of the United States. And also, it's, another kind of hard thing for Martin Van Buren to overcome was the fact that Jackson more or less hand-selected him to be president. So a lot of people in his party didn't have a lot of respect for him because they didn't think he earned the presidency that was more or less given to him. Kind of the phrase was, he came in beneath the coattails of Andrew Jackson. So he didn't have a lot of respect from his own party. All right. And, because kind of too, he was very mild-mannered compared to Jackson. Jackson was very, let's say he had a forceful personality. And then we get Martin Van Buren, he's kind of mild-mannered. So he's kind of a letdown to the Democrats, at least, compared to Jackson. All right, next section, Depression, Doldrums, and the Independent Treasury. Okay. So, as soon as Martin Van Buren more or less steps into the White House, becomes president, we see the Panic of 1837 happen, and it's a financial panic. And this panic is caused by a number of things. One, we had the failure of our wheat crop. There was this fly that infested our crops, and so the wheat crop failed, which then in turn made flour very expensive. That freaked people out. In England, there was a couple banks that had closed, and a lot of British investors became very nervous, though there's a lot of people who had given loans, a lot of British folks who had given loans to America. Now this bank closing made them nervous, so they recalled the loans from Americans. Americans not able to pay back those loans went bankrupt. That's not a good thing. And it's kind of Jackson's banking policies in the first place that helped bring about this panic. One of the biggest things, however, was land speculation. So land speculation was the idea that an average Joe without a lot of money would go to a bank, get a loan. With that loan, they would buy land as kind of a get-rich-quick scheme. So they would buy the land, not hoping to settle there themselves, but hoping then to turn around and sell the land at a profit. So they would get a loan, buy this land, wait till the land value increased. As soon as that land value increased, they would sell the land and take the profit. However, there are clearly ways that this scheme might not work. For example, say you purchase the land, and instead of the land rising in value, the land decreases in value. Well, what happens then is when the bank is calling in the loan saying, hey, you need to pay us back, the land speculator doesn't have any money, So the land speculator goes bankrupt, and then the bank loses out that money too. So if this happens to the bank enough, then the bank itself will fail, will say go bankrupt. So there was a lot of individual bankruptcies at this time due to land speculation, and that caused a lot of banks to fail. Even some of Jackson's pet banks. Remember, Jackson's idea was to, after he killed the Bank of the United States, he was putting the money into individual state banks called pet banks. So even some of the pet banks had failed. So the American government itself, through this panic, was losing a lot of money. All right. So how do we deal with this? Well, the Whigs, those who weren't in power, they wanted to get America actively involved, or the American government to become actively involved in kind of stopping this panic and kind of solving these issues. What they proposed were a number of things. They wanted to expand credit or give people money, hoping that people then would spend money, kickstart the economy. They also wanted to increase tariffs, kind of supporting American-made goods, hoping to kickstart the economy. They wanted the federal government to spend money on internal improvements like building bridges, roads, canals. That way, the national government more or less would be creating jobs, which would put money in people's pockets, which would then help kickstart the economy. So the Whigs were all about, hey, we have to, as the national government, step in and solve these economic woes. However, Martin Van Buren, being the good little Democrat he was very much believing that that was not the place of the national government. The national government shouldn't get involved with economic things. He believed that so much so that he proposed as a way to solve, or as kind of in response to this panic, he proposed something called, or nicknamed, the divorce bill. And what it's saying is that through this bill, the United States government is more or less divorcing from banks completely. So what Martin Van Buren wanted to do, his idea was to take all of the United States money out of these pet banks and to more or less lock them in a vault. Okay? It'd be good because they would stop losing money through these bank failures, but it's also bad because we're taking away money that could be used to give loans out. If we gave loans out, maybe that would help boost the economy, that sort of thing. But either way, this bill passes, and the actual name of this bill is the Independent Treasury Bill of 1840. That's saying that Martin Van Buren is taking all of the United States money out of these state banks and more or less locking it away in a vault. All right. Of course, the Whigs didn't like this idea because it's even a step further away from a national banking system, which is what they preferred. And the Democrats are more or less like, well, that's okay. We'll see how that works out. Okay, next section, gone to Texas. All right, so kind of remembering a little bit of what's been going on with Texas and the United States. When we had made an agreement with Spain to kind of get Florida as a part of that kind of negotiation there, the United States had given up any claim they had to Texas. So, for a long time, Texas had been owned by Spain. Well, what happens in, I don't even know what year it is. Oh, in 1821, what happens is the Mexican people themselves rise up through a revolution, and Mexico kind of declares their independence from Spain. So now Texas is not owned by Spain, now Texas is owned by Mexico. So this is what happens. The Mexican government starts to make a deal with this guy whose name is Stephen Austin, the guy who Austin, Texas is named after, of course. So the Mexican government says, Stephen Austin, I'll give you this huge chunk of land in Texas if you promise to bring 300 families to kind of help civilize or help establish this territory of Texas. Because at this time, not a lot of people lived there. They didn't have air conditioning, right? It wasn't a wonderful place, so there wasn't a lot of people in Texas. So kind of the Mexican government, as a way to kind of settle that area, give Stephen Austin this deal. I'll give you this huge chunk of land if you bring in families. However, the conditions were that these families were Catholic, and that these families also would then adopt Mexican culture, or kind of assimilate into the Mexican culture. So over the course of the next 10 years or so, over 30,000 Americans will rush into this new area of Texas. A lot of these Americans are from the South and the Southwest of America, just looking kind of for more land. A lot of cotton farmers are now kind of moving to Texas. All right. Well, there's some problems that arise through this. There's some conflicts that kind of happen here. One, the Texans aren't kind of holding up their end of the bargain, because the Texans are not assimilating into Mexican culture. They are more or less a bunch of Americans who happen to be living in Mexican-controlled Texas. All right, and also there's another thing that's happening here involving the issue of slavery. In 1830, the country of Mexico had outlawed slavery. However, these Texans continued to bring slaves into this territory. Remember, they're mostly cotton farmers, so they needed slaves for their economic system to work. So the Texans were bringing in slaves. And also something to note at this time too, a lot of people who are moving to Texas, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the people who are moving for Texas are more or less outlaws, or people who are trying to run away from the American government. People who had broken laws, running away from the authorities, end up moving to Texas. So the people in Texas are really kind of rough around the edges, you could say. You don't want to mess with Texas. Some people who move there, not necessarily as convicts, but our famous people, Davy Crockett moves to Texas. Jim Bowie, the guy who invented the Bowie knife, moves to Texas. Sam Houston, he's an ex-governor of Tennessee, moved to Texas as well. So anyway, Santa Anna, he is the dictator or the leader of Mexico at this time. And he does not like how these Texans are more or less showing blatant disrespect for their treaty or blatant disrespect for their rules. So as kind of in retaliation against that, what Santa Anna does is he imprisons Stephen Austin for about 8 months. Then 2, he kind of takes away all of the Texans' rights and starts to raise an army to go and suppress these kind of rambunctious Texans. That brings us to the next section, the Lone Star Rebellion. So 1836, Texas decides to declare their independence from Mexico. And this is what happens. Santa Anna, the dictator, of course, is bringing his troops up to Texas to kind of suppress these rambunctious Texans. What happens is 6,000 of Santa Anna's troops are going to be surrounding 200 Texan volunteers at a place called the Alamo. The Alamo was a mission. It was kind of like a walled-in church. So 6,000 of Santa Anna's troops are more or less have trapped 200 American soldiers at the Alamo. Well, the soldiers, I should say Texas. So these Texan soldiers hold out for about 13 days, but finally these forces of Santa Anna overtake them and everyone is killed. Something similar happens later on at a place called Goliad. This time it's 400 Texans who are surrounded by Santa Anna's troops, but this time the Texans, they put up the white flag, they surrender. However, Santa Anna, being the dictator he is, decides instead of respecting their surrender, kills them all anyway. So, back in the United States, the cry of "Remember the Alamo" is kind of going out amongst the people. So a lot of Americans themselves will go to Texas and fight on the side of the Texans. Kind of the last battle of this conflict is at a place called San Jacinto. So what's happening here is we have Santa Anna's troops kind of pursuing the American troops. The American troops are led by Sam Houston, the guy we name Houston, Texas after. Sam Houston you can kind of think is the George Washington of this Texas independence movement. So Santa Anna's troops are pursuing Sam Houston's troops. Sam Houston's troops, being intelligent, decide to take advantage of the fact that Santa Anna's troops take siestas. So as they're being pursued, Santa Anna's troops are taking a siesta. The Texas troops under Sam Houston turn around and attack Santa Anna's troops at this Battle of San Jacinto. So what happens through this battle? Texas troops are able to capture Santa Anna, and then Santa Anna is more or less kind of forced to recognize Texas independence. He promises to take all the Mexican troops out of Texas, and two, he kind of establishes the border of the Rio Grande as the border between Texas and Mexico. So more or less, Santa Anna, because he's captured at this Battle of San Jacinto, is forced to recognize Texas independence. What happens? Santa Anna is released, and as soon as he's released, he declares that treaty he had made recognizing their independence null and void because he was forced to sign it under threat of life. So now it kind of goes to the United States to decide. Okay, is the United States government going to recognize the Texas independence, or are they not? Well, Jackson decides to indeed recognize Texas independence. And I mean, that was by far very popular. Most Americans were for recognizing Texas's independence. But the thing was, Texas didn't want to become their own country. What they really wanted is to become a part or a state in the United States. However, Jackson's hands were kind of tied, okay? Because there was a huge kind of growing movement in the North that was very against slavery, or the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, that did not want to see Texas become part of the United States because that would upset the balance we had going since the kind of Missouri Compromise. If Texas had entered, they would obviously be a slave state, and they didn't want to upset the balance they had going. So more or less, Jackson says, okay, fine, I'll recognize you as a country, but I'm not going to let you annex. I'm not going to let you join the United States because I don't want to deal with this issue of slavery. Yeah. Okay, next section, log cabins and hard cider of 1840. So this is talking about the new presidential election, the election of 1840. So Martin Van Buren, of course, is president at this time, and he is renominated kind of without enthusiasm by the Democratic Party. And then the Whigs, realizing their strategy they tried last time of kind of spreading out the votes among favorite sons didn't work, decided to throw all of their support behind General William Henry Harrison. So something to note is Harrison, he's not the candidate who would make the best president. Remember, maybe Henry Clay would have made a better president, but he's the candidate they felt had the greatest chance of winning. So this is what they kind of do. They like Harrison because he's never really had a stand on any issues, which means he doesn't really have any enemies. So they like that. They like the fact that he doesn't have enemies. And of course, he's the war hero from the Battle of Tippecanoe. Remember, Tippecanoe was kind of the Indians Confederacy's last stand, last united stand against Americans. Well, Henry Harrison had been the leader of that battle. He had won, and then so he came to national prominence that way. And their vice president under Harrison, his name is John Tyler, which becomes important. We'll see later on. So the campaign slogan the Whigs have going here is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe, of course, being our hero of that battle, Harrison, and then Tyler is the vice president candidate. So the Whig strategy here is to present Harrison as a common person. Okay, they had seen how successful Jackson was when Jackson kind of appealed to just the masses, the common folks. So the Whigs are like, two can play at this game, so they present Harrison as just this really common person, the people's person, that sort of thing. And of course it wasn't true, but they said that, Harrison would be happy living in a log cabin with a barrel of hard cider. That's where this section gets its name, Log Cabins and Hard Cider, presenting, Harrison as just a simple person who would be happy living in a log cabin with some hard cider. And of course, this is not true. Harrison had been born into a very, very wealthy family and was currently living in a 16-room mansion. But regardless, they're trying to present him as this common person. All right, so this election really wasn't about a specific issue. Before we had seen maybe the issue being the national bank, but this election was more or less didn't have a lot of issues. But you could say the Whigs in general, there was an issue, the Whigs were more about actively solving the United States' economic woes, and the Democrats were more of staying out of the economy, keeping the business out of the economy. The Democrats didn't think it should be the government's business to control business. All right, section S, politics for the people. So the election of 1840 was important because we kind of start to see a shift. Before this time, remember thinking about George Washington or John Adams, it had been a good thing for you to be kind of one of the elite people in government, to be a wealthy person, to be a kind of upper crust person. Now, that is slowly shifting away. Now it's better to be presented as a common person. Now it's better if you were from humble beginnings. Okay? So we see this, of course, in this election, presenting Harrison, who is actually just a wealthy dude, kind of posing as a humble guy. We see in this election, Harrison presenting himself, trying to appeal to the masses as a common person. And this is kind of true not just of the presidential campaign, but of all politicians. Most politicians continued to be people from the upper crust, but the difference now is they are trying to present themselves as common people in order to get the votes of the common people. It wasn't a good thing now if you were, as a politician, if you were too clean or dressed too well or used, maybe too many fancy words. That wasn't a good thing. You want to be seen, kind of as the common person. I don't know how many times I could say that, but I think I've said that about 3 times. And the critics of these kind of posing politicians called the Congress the coonskin Congress, because these congressmen were trying to present themselves as common people, were kind of like wearing coonskin hats instead of silk hats, silk top hats, that sort of thing. So we just kind of see this shift through this election of kind of turning away from wanting to be an elitist to trying to appeal to the common people by kind of showing your down-to-earthness, so to speak. All right, last section, the two-party system. So the Whigs are now really growing up. They're not just a party that's against Jackson. Now they have a platform. They really are a mature political party. In fact, we see that one of their candidates, Harrison, actually wins the election. And as we kind of mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, Americans are now starting to realize the value of having political parties. Before this time, the Founding Fathers were very against political parties because they thought political parties equaled conflict, equaled disunity. But now we're seeing, Americans more or less embracing the idea of having a two-party system. And in general, well, I'm just going to kind of talk about which each party kind of stood for. The Democrats were all about individual liberties, all about states' rights, all about the federal government not getting involved in economic and social issues. Okay. On the other hand, we have our friends the Whigs, and they're all about kind of building community, the value of community, kind of the greater good. They saw people who were going after their self-interests. They thought that would lead to division, to conflict. They were all about the government getting involved in economic things. For example, they wanted that national bank to come back. They wanted to, create protective tariffs. They wanted to have internal improvement, creating jobs, that sort of thing. And also, the Whigs wanted to get involved kind of in social issues. So the Whigs were very much against slavery. The Whigs were also for the prohibition of liquor. So the Whigs want to kind of have the national government control both economic and social issues. The Democrats thought that wasn't the place of government at all. But regardless of their differences, they did have a similarity, which was a good thing. They were both mass-based parties, and this is what I mean. Both parties had members from different social classes and from different locations in the United States. So there were people who were members of the Democratic Party who were wealthy, and there were members of the Democratic Party who were poor. Same thing with the Whigs. There were poor members of the Whig Party, and there were rich members of the Whig Party. And it wasn't sectionalized, okay? It's not like the North was all Whigs and the South was all Democrats. There are people in the South who are Whigs, there are people in the North who are Whigs, there are people in the West that are Democrats, there are people in the North who are Democrats. So really, both parties were trying to appeal to the masses. They were both very geographically and socially diverse, you could say, which is a good thing, because before this time we were kind of seeing a lot of sectionalism going on. We had New England kind of versus the West versus the South, but now because both of these parties are kind of trying to appeal to the masses, the sectionalism is kind of dampered a little bit, which is a good thing. And with that, I think we are done with this chapter.